The men laughed when they saw her, and one of them even spat into the dirt and said no man would pay for a woman like that. But before the sun set that same day, one man would step forward and choose her anyway, not out of pity, not out of desperation, but because he saw something no one else had the courage to look at. The stagecoach wheels groaned as they rolled to a stop in the frozen dust of Red Hollow, a wind-bitten town pressed between dry hills and stubborn sky, where men came to build fortunes and buried more dreams than they ever spoke of. Inside the coach, Eliza Crowe sat perfectly still, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her breath shallow beneath the weight of stairs she hadn't yet faced but already felt waiting for her outside. The journey west had taken nearly 3 weeks, long enough for the other women to whisper when they thought she couldn't hear, long enough for them to shift away from her on narrow benches, long enough for silence to grow thick whenever she lifted her veil to eat. She had learned not to blame them. The scars along the left side of her face, twisted, pale, and unkind, had a way of deciding things for people before she ever spoke a word. Fire did that. It didn't just take skin. It took choices. The coach door creaked open, and the driver called out the town's name like it mattered. Red Hollow. End of the line. One by one, the women climbed down, boots touching dust, eyes searching for the men who had paid for their passage. Men who now stood gathered near the wooden platform like buyers at an auction, hats low, expressions expectant. Eliza did not move. Her pulse thudded loudly in her ears. She had known this moment would come, had told herself over and over that she would face it with what dignity she had left. But now that it was here, she found herself gripping the edge of the seat, as if staying inside would somehow delay what waited beyond that door. "Ma'am," the driver said, softer now. "You getting off?" Eliza swallowed, then stood. The motion sent a sharp pull across her ribs where the burns stretched beneath her dress, a quiet reminder of everything she carried with her. She stepped down carefully, boots meeting the cold ground, and for a brief second, the world seemed to pause. Then the murmuring began. It started low, like wind through dry grass, then grew just enough to reach her ears. "That her? God help him if that's the last one. Ain't right, sending something like that out here." Eliza kept her gaze forward, her veil drawn but not enough to hide everything. She had stopped hiding completely somewhere along the journey west. There was no point. The truth always found its way through cloth and shadow. The other women were already being greeted, some with awkward smiles, others with cautious relief, as men stepped forward to claim what they had arranged for in letters and coin. Names were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Futures, uncertain but agreed upon, began to take shape. Eliza stood alone at the edge of it all, her small travel case at her feet, waiting for a name that might never be spoken. One of the men glanced at her, then quickly looked away. Another lingered a moment longer, his gaze catching on the scars visible along her cheek, before he shook his head almost imperceptibly and turned back to the others. Time stretched. The crowd thinned. Boots moved away. Laughter rose and faded. And still, no one came for her. She had known this might happen. The advertisement had been clear enough. Men out west wanted capable wives, women who could work, endure, and bear children. They did not ask for beauty, not directly, but they expected something close enough. Something untouched. Something whole. Eliza bent slightly, picking up her case, preparing herself for the quiet humiliation of asking the driver what came next for women who were not chosen. But before she could speak, a voice cut through the thinning noise behind her. "You waiting on someone?" It wasn't mocking. It wasn't kind either. It was simply direct. Eliza turned. The man standing a few paces away was taller than most, his shoulders broad beneath a worn coat, his hat casting a shadow across a face marked more by weather than by softness. He did not step closer immediately. He did not stare the way the others had. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching, as if he had already decided something and was only confirming it now. "I was supposed to be," Eliza answered quietly. "Doesn't seem he showed." The man nodded once, as though that settled something in his mind. "Name's Caleb Boone." He gestured briefly toward the emptying street. "I didn't send for a bride." Eliza felt a small, hollow drop in her chest. "Then I suppose. But I saw what happened just now," he continued, cutting gently across her words. Silence stretched between them for a moment, filled only by the distant creak of wagon wheels and the low murmur of those already leaving town. Caleb's gaze shifted briefly to the others, then back to her. You got anywhere else to go? The question landed heavier than it sounded. Eliza thought of the city she had left behind, of the narrow rooms and narrower futures, of the way people had begun to look at her after the fire, as if she were something that had survived by mistake. She thought of the miles she had traveled with no promise waiting at the end. No, she said finally. Caleb nodded again, slow and certain. He stepped forward then, closing the distance not like a man claiming something, but like a man offering something instead. My place is about 2 hours north, he said. Ranch. Hard work. Not much in the way of comfort. A faint pause. But it's honest. Eliza searched his face, looking for the catch, the hidden edge, the expectation that always followed offers like this. Why? She asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. His eyes moved over her face, not lingering on the scars, not avoiding them either, simply seeing them as part of her and nothing more. Because you didn't run, he said at last. The answer caught her off guard. From what? From them, he said, nodding toward the town, toward the man who had looked and turned away. Most folks would have kept that veil down, or stayed on the coach. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, something small but steady. I'm tired of hiding, she admitted. Caleb's mouth twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel like one. He reached down and picked up her travel case before she could stop him, lifting it as if it weighed nothing at all. Then he looked back at her, not with expectation, not with pressure, just with quiet certainty. If you're willing, he said, you can come with me. Behind them, one of the men let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Boone's lost his mind, someone muttered. Taking the one no one else would. Caleb didn't turn. Eliza heard the words clearly, felt their familiar sting, but for once, they didn't settle as deep as they used to. Because for the first time since the fire, someone had not looked at her and seen what was missing. He had looked and seen what remained. Eliza drew a slow breath, then stepped forward, closing the space between them. All right, she said quietly. And when she followed him away from the town, away from the whispers and the judgment, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in a long time. This wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a rescue. It was something far more dangerous than either. It was a choice. The boy said she wouldn't last the week, and by the third morning, with blood on her hands and frost in her bones, even Eliza began to wonder if he might be right. But the man who brought her there never once asked her to leave, and that made all the difference. The ranch sat farther out than she expected, tucked into a wide stretch of land where the wind never seemed to rest, and the silence felt deeper than anything she had known back east. It wasn't the kind of place built for comfort. It was built to endure. A weathered house stood near a long barn, both shaped by years of hard use, not decoration. Fences cut across the land like scars, holding in horses that watched her arrival with quiet curiosity. Caleb climbed down from the wagon first, setting her case aside before offering her a hand. Not pulling her down, not rushing her, just waiting. Eliza stepped onto the frozen ground, her boots sinking slightly into the dusting of snow, her eyes moving slowly over everything that might now become her life. It was too big, too empty, too permanent. It's not much, Caleb said, though there was something steady in his voice that suggested otherwise. Eliza shook her head faintly. It's more than I expected. Before anything else could be said, the front door of the house burst open, and a boy came running out, his steps quick and sharp as if he had been waiting too long already. He stopped short when he saw her. His expression changed instantly. Not curiosity, not even surprise. Something harder, something older than his years. This her? He asked, looking at Caleb but not bothering to lower his voice. Caleb's tone stayed calm. This is Eliza. The boy's gaze shifted fully to her then, and he didn't hide what he saw. His eyes caught on her scars, lingered there, then narrowed. She ain't staying, he said flatly. The words landed without hesitation, like they had been waiting for a reason to exist. Eliza felt the sting of them, sharper than the whispers back in town, because this wasn't strangers talking. This was someone she would have to live beside. Caleb stepped forward slightly. That's enough, Jonah. But the boy didn't back down. Last one didn't stay, he shot back. And the one before that didn't either. His arms crossed tightly over his chest. Why would this one be any different? Silence stretched between them, the cold pressing in around the edges of the moment. Eliza could have said nothing, could have let Caleb answer for her. But something in the boy's voice, something raw and unguarded beneath the anger, made her step forward instead. "You're right," she said quietly. Both of them looked at her, surprised. Jonah frowned. "I don't know you," she continued, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "And you don't know me." She clasped her hands together, grounding herself. "So let's not pretend we do." The boy's expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with his suspicion. "Then what?" he asked. Eliza took a slow breath. "Give me 30 days, she said. "That's all." Caleb's head tilted slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Jonah narrowed his eyes. "And then, if I'm still here," Eliza said, "you decide for yourself if I'm worth keeping around." The bluntness of her words seemed to catch him off guard. "And if you leave," he pressed. Eliza's lips curved faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Then you were right about me." The wind shifted between them, carrying the faint smell of hay and wood smoke. Jonah studied her for a long moment, as if trying to find the weakness he expected to be there. Finally, he shrugged, though it wasn't careless. It was cautious. 30 days, he muttered. Then he turned and walked back toward the house, his boots crunching in the snow. Halfway there, he paused, glancing back just once. 29 now, he added before disappearing inside. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Caleb stepped beside her, his gaze following the boy's retreat. "That went better than usual," he said. She glanced at him. "You've done this before?" "Tried," he admitted. A brief pause. "Didn't work out." Eliza nodded slowly, understanding more than he had said. "I'll try not to add to the pattern." Caleb looked at her then. Really looked, his expression thoughtful but not doubtful. "You don't seem like the quitting kind." Inside, the house was warm but plain, the kind of place where everything had a purpose and nothing was wasted on decoration. Eliza removed her gloves slowly, her fingers stiff from the cold, her eyes taking in the small details. The worn table, the iron stove, the careful order of a life built piece by piece. It felt lived in, but not lived with. Like something had been missing for a long time. "Kitchen's yours if you want it," Caleb said from behind her. "Same with the rest of the house." She turned slightly. "You're just handing it over?" He shrugged. "It's been waiting on someone who'd use it." The words settled into her more deeply than she expected. No one had ever offered her space like that before. Not without conditions. Not without expectations tied to it. Before she could respond, Jonah reappeared, leaning against the doorway, watching her like she might disappear if he looked away too long. "You ever worked a ranch before?" he asked. "No," Eliza said honestly. "Good," he replied. "Then you won't have bad habits." Caleb huffed a quiet laugh under his breath. The next morning came early, colder than the last, the sky pale and unforgiving. Eliza woke stiff and sore, the journey still lingering in her bones, but she didn't stay in bed. She dressed quickly, ignoring the tight pull of scarred skin beneath her clothes, and stepped into the kitchen where Caleb was already moving about, and Jonah sat eating in silence. "Morning," Caleb said simply. Eliza tied on the apron hanging near the door. "Tell me what needs doing." Jonah snorted softly. "You just got here." "And," she replied. He hesitated, then said, "Chickens need feeding. Eggs collecting." A pause. "They peck." Eliza nodded once. "I'll manage." Outside, the cold bit harder than the day before, but she didn't slow. Jonah followed, not offering help exactly, but not leaving either. The chickens were restless, shifting and clucking as she reached beneath them for the first egg. The hen snapped, its beak striking her knuckle hard enough to draw blood. Pain flared instantly. Jonah watched closely. "There it is," he said, almost like he had been waiting for it. Eliza pulled her hand back, staring at the thin line of red, then wiped it against her apron without a word. She reached in again, faster this time. Another egg, then another. Jonah's expression shifted slightly. Not impressed. Not yet. But something had changed. By the time the basket was full, her fingers were numb, her back aching, and her hands stone, but she hadn't stopped. Jonah took the basket from her without comment. "Goat's next," he said. Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Does it bite?" "Worse," he replied. Inside the barn, the goat proved him right, kicking twice before she found the rhythm of it. Each mistake earned her a bruise or a near fall, but she didn't quit. By the time they returned to the house, carrying eggs and milk, Caleb looked up from his work and studied her quietly. "You quit?" he asked Jonah. "Nope," the boy said. "Got kicked though. I'm standing right here," Eliza muttered. Jonah shrugged. "Didn't cry." Caleb's mouth twitched slightly. "That's something." Later, as he cleaned the cut on her hand, his touch careful despite the roughness of his hands, he said softly, "You don't have to prove anything." Eliza met his eyes. "I'm not trying to prove anything." "Then what are you doing?" She hesitated, then answered honestly, "Trying not to be the kind of person who leaves." Caleb. The man who came for her brought law in one hand and violence in the other, and by the time the dust settled, everyone in the valley would understand the difference between a woman being owned and a woman being chosen. It started just after dawn, when the sky was still pale and the frost hadn't yet lifted from the ground, the kind of quiet morning that made trouble feel louder when it came. Eliza was at the pump, hauling water with stiff arms, her breath fogging in the cold, when the sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Not one rider. Several. She froze for half a second, then turned toward the ridge. 3 men crested it first, their coats dark, their posture wrong for neighbors or traders. Behind them, riding slower, deliberate and certain, came a 4th. Even at a distance, she knew him. Victor Hale sat his horse like he owned the land beneath it, like every mile he had crossed had already been decided in his favor. Her stomach tightened. For a moment, the old fear tried to take hold. The same cold, suffocating feeling that had followed her across states, across nights where she slept with one eye open, always listening for footsteps that might come too close. But this time, she didn't run. The door behind her opened, and Caleb stepped out, already reading the situation before a word was spoken. Jonah followed close behind, his expression hardening the second he saw the riders. Inside, Caleb said quietly to Eliza. She didn't move. "No," she replied. He glanced at her once, measuring, then gave a small nod. He didn't argue. That alone steadied her more than anything else could have. The riders stopped 20 yards from the house. Snow crunched under hooves as Victor dismounted, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve before lifting his gaze toward her. "Eliza," he said, as if greeting her in a parlor instead of at the edge of a standoff. His voice hadn't changed. Smooth, controlled, possessive. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble." Eliza stepped forward, stopping just short of Caleb. "You shouldn't have come," she said. Victor smiled faintly. "On the contrary, I've come to correct a mistake." His eyes shifted briefly to Caleb, then back to her, dismissing him in a single glance. "You left without understanding your position." "I understood it perfectly," she answered. "That's why I left." The air between them tightened. One of the men behind Victor shifted in his saddle, hand resting too casually near his weapon. Caleb didn't move, but Eliza could feel the readiness in him, the quiet tension of someone who had faced worse and survived it. Victor's expression cooled slightly. "You belong under my guardianship," he said, pulling folded papers from his coat. "These documents make that very clear." He held them up, not offering them, just displaying them like proof of something already decided. "You are not in a position to refuse." Jonah stepped forward, anger flashing across his face. "She ain't going anywhere." Victor's gaze flicked toward him, irritation sharp and immediate. "Children shouldn't speak in matters they don't understand." Caleb's voice came low and steady. "He understands enough." Victor studied him more carefully now, as if finally acknowledging his presence. "You must be the man who thinks he's doing something noble," he said, taking in what no one else would. The words were meant to cut, and for a second, Eliza felt their familiar weight, but before they could settle, Caleb spoke. "I didn't take her," he said simply. "She chose to come." Victor let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Joyce," he repeated. "You think a woman like her has the luxury of choice?" Eliza felt something inside her sharpen, something that had been building since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. She moved forward, past Caleb, until she stood fully in front of Victor. "I do now," she said. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. Victor's eyes narrowed, studying her, as if trying to find the weakness he remembered. "You're being influenced," he said. "This man has filled your head with ideas that won't survive the real world." Eliza shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "He gave me something you never did." Victor's jaw tightened. "And what exactly is that?" She held his gaze without flinching. "The ability to say no." The words landed harder than any blow. For a moment, Victor didn't speak. Then his expression hardened completely, whatever pretense of civility he had brought with him falling away. "You misunderstand the situation," he said coldly. "Those papers give me legal authority. I can take you back whether you agree or not." Caleb stepped forward then, just enough to stand beside her again. "You can try," he said. The three men behind Victor shifted again, tension rising like a storm about to break. Jonah moved closer to Eliza, not behind her, not hiding, standing beside her, small but unyielding. Victor looked between them, something calculating flickering behind his eyes. "You're willing to risk everything for this?" he asked her. "For a place like this? For people you barely know?" Eliza didn't hesitate. "Yes." It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was absolute. Victor exhaled slowly, as if reconsidering, though there was no softness in him. "Then let me make this simple," he said. "I'll buy the land." Caleb didn't even blink. "Not for sale. Everything has a price." "Not this." Victor's gaze sharpened. "You'd turn down more money than you've seen in your entire life?" Caleb's voice stayed even. Already half. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the weight of what wasn't being said. Victor studied him for a long moment, then gave a small, tight smile. "You think this is about her," he said quietly. "It isn't." Eliza felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Then what is it?" she asked. Victor's eyes met hers again, and for the first time, there was something honest in them. Not kind, not good, but honest. "This land," he said. "There's silver running beneath it. Survey reports from years back. That's why you were here, Eliza. Not for marriage. Not for a fresh start. You were convenient." The truth hit like a blow. For a second, the world tilted. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something in his posture went still, focused. "You used me," Eliza said quietly. Victor shrugged faintly. "I intended to provide for you. That's more than most would offer." Silence stretched again, heavier than before. Then Eliza took a step back, closer to Caleb, closer to Jonah, to the life she had begun to build with her own hands. "No," she said. "You intended to own me." Victor's smile vanished completely. "Last chance," he said. "Come willingly." Eliza shook her head. "I already made my choice." The moment broke like a snapped wire. One of Victor's men shifted forward, but Caleb's rifle was raised in the same instant, steady and certain. "That's far enough," he said. No one moved. Not for a long second. Then another. Finally, Victor lifted a hand slightly, stopping his men. He looked at Eliza one last time, his expression no longer angry, just cold. "This isn't over," he said. "It is for me," she replied. He held her gaze, searching, perhaps hoping for doubt. He found none. With a sharp motion, he turned, mounting his horse in one smooth movement. The others followed, their presence retreating slowly. Then all at once as they rode back over the ridge and out of sight, the silence that followed felt different. Not empty. Earned. Eliza realized her hands were shaking, but she didn't try to hide it. Jonah let out a breath beside her. "He ain't coming back, right?" he asked. Caleb lowered the rifle slowly. "Not like that," he said. Eliza looked out toward the ridge, then back at the ranch, at the house, at the two people standing beside her. "I'm not leaving," she said quietly. Caleb met her eyes. "I know." Jonah shifted awkwardly, then muttered, "Good." Eliza smiled faintly, the tension in her chest easing for the first time since the riders appeared. The wind moved through the valley, softer now, carrying the quiet promise of something settled. And as she stood there, no longer running, no longer hiding, she understood something clearly at last. She had not been taken. She had not been bought. She had been given a choice. And this time, she had chosen herself.